let's put pay to this absolute myth that medieval swords are heavy and chunky objects compared to later period, Industrial Revolution period swords. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now this is a very simple premise, but it's something that is a very pervasive myth that goes back probably to the 19th century, I would say even the early 20th century. It was something that features in Victorian literature, but also something which was reinforced in the age of Hollywood, in the age of movies, and still carries on to this day. So there is a very widely held belief amongst non-sword people. If you know anything about swords, you know this. But this video might be useful to share with your non-sword friends. And that is that medieval swords are inherently bigger and heavier and sort of more unwieldy than later period swords. Now, it must be admitted there are certain types of sword which are extremely light. For example, small swords. Small swords can be as light as 400 grams. I am going to use metric in this video, incidentally. I'll stick with one system. Although, being British, we do use metric and imperial, but most of the viewers out there, I think, will understand the metric. But it doesn't really matter if you just compare the numbers against each other. So, yes, indeed, something like a small sword can be 400-500 grams. And certain military sabres can be as light as 600 grams. However, that's not the norm. If we look at military swords used in warfare, what you find is actually if we go all the way back to the early medieval period, there isn't really a big variation in the weight of swords if we come forward into the late medieval period, or indeed as we go into the Renaissance or into the industrial era. What we find is that most one-handed swords, we'll talk a bit about two-handed swords in a second, but most one-handed swords fit within the same kind of ballpark, the same kinds of parameters. So, simply what numbers are we talking about here? So you'll often find that one-handed, let's put down the later period sword for a second, one-handed medieval swords, of which I'm very familiar. If you don't know, so I'm working with Windlass and the Royal Armouries. I get hands-on Royal Armouries original swords, which we replicate as precisely as we possibly can with the Windlass line. But in addition to that, over the years, I've done videos with people like Toby Capwell at the Wallace Collection. I'm an antique dealer, so I handle and deal in antique swords all the time. So in my life, I've not handled as many medieval swords as someone like Peter Johnson, but I have handled dozens, shall we say, scores, probably over 100 original medieval swords, maybe between 100 and 200 medieval swords in my life. And I've documented and recorded a lot of those. That means I've measured them, I've weighed them, I've held them in my hand, I've felt their balance. Now, medieval swords obviously come in a lot of varieties. There are one-handed ones, two-handed ones, there's double-edged, single-edged, covers a broad period of time, let's say around 1,000 years thereabouts, depending how you classify the medieval period. And indeed there's things like falchions as well. We'll talk about those in a second. But if I just pick up this replica here. So this is one of the second batch. This is a prototype actually of the second batch of the Windlass Royal Armouries line. This has the almost exact same stats as the original Royal Armouries example. Here we've got a late Anglo-Saxon 10th century style sword. A completely different style of sword. So this is late 10th century, that one was end of the 15th century. And here we've got a very good replica by Albion. So this is the Albion Lancaster, a very nice sword that I'm very fond of, which is inspired by some of the Castillon swords. And again, these are designed by Peter Johnson, and they have very similar statistics to the Castillon swords of the probably mid 15th century. Maybe talk more about the Castillon swords in a video soon. And all of these swords come within a certain ballpark. So these are all kind of typical one-handed double-edged swords, and they tend to vary in weight between about 800 grams and about 1,300 grams. Most of them fit within that window, 800 grams to 1,300 grams. But that's quite a wide window. It might not sound like a lot. 500 grams difference might not sound an awful lot. But actually in your hand and with different balances and stuff, these are all one-handed swords. The difference between, I mean, even just within the so-called Viking era, if we take a sword, an Anglo-Saxon or Frankish or Scandinavian sword, which is 800 grams, and then you pick up an example, there are examples from Sweden and Finland and elsewhere which are really heavy, like 1,300 grams, And they feel really different in the hand, even though they're from the same culture, they're from the same period, they're used for the same purpose, they're used with a shield, they're used against the same kind of armour, by the same kinds of social class and everything else. So they're basically very similar design swords, but wildly different weights. And you find that equally with, if we come all the way towards the end of the medieval period, arming swords, for example. So you'll find that arming swords, some are very light, some are very heavy. Obviously they vary in shape, but overall most of them tend to be double-edged and with a crossguard and a pommel. And so they are within the same kind of set, they're within the same family, but actually their weights can vary quite a lot. Now, if we fast forward, so the original premise here, why am I talking about it? Well, over the years of talking about medieval swords, but also, as you know, I have a love of 19th century swords. I've seen, and 18th century swords, I've seen a lot of people describe these kind of like industrial era, modern era, early modern era, well, not even early modern, middle modern era, age of gunpowder swords as being somehow light and flimsy compared to medieval swords. And this is just incorrect. Now, I've got a couple of exaggerated examples to make the point here. So here is a French cuirassier's sword. Now, I've done a number of videos about the cuirassiers and their swords, and you can look up those videos in my search in my videos. And this is a big, beefy sword. It's got a massive, great 37, 38-inch blade. It is heavy in the hand. Compared to all of those medieval replicas I just showed, which are all based closely on originals, this is a beefier sword. This is actually, it's a longer blade, it's a slightly heavier in the blade, it's a bit more cumbersome to move around. This is more of a handful, and has a heavier handguard, I'd note as well, than most medieval swords. And certainly if I pick up the Albion Lancaster, this is a more nimble sword. I mean, they're different kinds of swords for a different period, and you know, with different designs. But in that particular case, the industrial era, the early 19th century sword, the 1816 blade on it, so it's just post-Napoleonic. The Napoleonic period sword is actually bigger and heavier than the kind of Wars of the Roses 100 Years' War period sword, which would have been used with armour and against armour and all of this kind of stuff. Another example I'll just grab here, off my table of swords, which you can't see unfortunately, which is off camera, is the 1788 pattern. Now, I featured this in a number of videos, and it is a fantastic model sword. I absolutely love it. I do prefer it to the cuirassier sword in a number of ways. And this incidentally would have been what the British in the 1790s would have been using against the French cuirassiers. So if British heavy cavalry came up against French heavy cavalry in the early years of the Napoleonic Wars, a lot of them would have had this. And I would rather have this than the French cuirassier sword. The French cuirassier sword is arguably better in the thrust, it's stiffer in the thrust, but this is a better cut and thrust blade, and it feels better in the hand and has better hand protection. I prefer the British one. Not entirely patriotic, I don't think. I think I'm being impartial. I think it is just a better sword, but obviously that's my view. But the design of this actually harks back to earlier 18th century back swords, and in fact this might be a pre-1788 example, so it could be from the 1770s, so American War of Independence period. And this has got a similarly massive blade, and this is a cavalry sword. This is specifically made for cavalry. Now that's something which is worth mentioning, is that by the time we get to the 18th and 19th century, we often get swords which are made for people on foot, swords which are made for people on horseback. In the knightly age, the medieval period, usually swords, not always, but usually swords don't fit into one of those two. The knightly sword, the knightly arming sword, has to be able to function in both capacities. So a sword like the Albion Lancaster here would be used by a knight on foot, or a knight on horseback, or an archer on foot, or a light cavalryman. This is an all-purpose, general-purpose cut and thrust sword. Whereas, theoretically anyway, the larger cavalry swords, like the 1788 here, are dedicated cavalry swords. Yes, you can use them on foot. I mean, I could use this on foot, but it's a bit cumbersome on foot. It is really designed for extra reach and extra robustness to stand up to the rigours of mounted combat, even though they're using this in a period where there's almost no armour. I mean, there are helmets and there are sometimes breastplates for cuirassiers, but by and large this isn't an age of armour anymore, whereas the medieval swords have to be robust enough to stand up to hitting helmets and brigandines and gauntlets and bucklers and shields on a regular basis. They also potentially need to parry things like poleaxes or halberds or maces, whereas these really don't. These, for the most part, in the industrial age are only, unless you're in colonial warfare, going to go up against other swords of a similar type. This is pretty much the beefiest hand weapon of this period, unless you go to like India or Persia, where you might come up against battle axes and maces and stuff like this, and armour. But by and large, within European warfare, these only come up against each other. Whereas I'll grab a different one this time, a medieval arming sword, as I say, might have to deal with parrying a blow from a poleaxe or a mace, and might be used in half swording and thrusting into armoured gaps and hitting helmets and this kind of stuff. So this kind of sword, even though it in theory should have to stand up to more robust encounters with other weapons, actually, if we look at the weight categories, these cavalry swords of the 18th and 19th centuries actually weigh about the same as the heaviest arming swords of the medieval period. So I think what it really comes down to is what a person can manage in terms of weight. There is an optimum weight range for a one-handed sword. It doesn't matter whether you're in the Roman era, the Viking era, Wars of the Roses or 100 Years War era, or Condottieri Wars in Italy, or whatever, late medieval, whether you're in the Renaissance, so when you've got these robust kind of military style rapiers with cut and thrust blades, as I've mentioned in previous videos, that are basically like medieval arming swords with more hand protection. Whether you're in the age of the Highlanders and Culloden, the Jacobite rebellion of the 18th century, whether you're in the age of Napoleon, or indeed World War I trenches, there is an optimum weight range for one-handed swords. So, there are two other types of swords I mentioned, which I'm only going to deal with briefly because they could kind of get their own videos. So one of those is two-handed swords. So fundamentally, yes, two-handed swords are obviously heavier because they're bigger. This is from the first batch of the Royal Armourer's windlass line, which I worked on. And clearly, this type of big, giant longsword, or any other two-handed sword, is going to be a bit heavier on average because it is bigger. Now, there are some light longswords, which are essentially like an arming sword with a long hilt. We sometimes refer to those as hand-and-a-half swords or bastard swords, and those, in fact, sometimes are no heavier than an arming sword. So that's the lowest end of the spectrum. But as the swords get bigger, and as we get up to big spadone and zweihanders like this, clearly they're going to get heavier. However, once they get to that kind of size, it's kind of unfair comparing them with other swords because they're now in the size category of polearms. And in fact, they end up with a mass range, or with a weight range, quite similar to polearms. So actually, if we look at a two-handed sword like this, this does weigh about the same as a halberd. A two-handed sword like that does weigh about the same as a poleaxe. So size for size, they're actually quite comparable. Now, the other type of sword I mentioned were falchions. I'm only going to briefly touch on falchions, but just to say, a lot of people are under the misconception that a falchion is, because it looked wide and choppy, is heavier than a medieval arming sword. Now, it's not true, okay? They come in the same weight ranges. In fact, there is a falchion, it's relatively short, but there is a falchion from the Castillon group. It's in the Royal Armourers. I have seen it myself. I haven't picked it up because it's very fragile, but I have closely looked at it. And also I've looked at the stats for that, and that is very, very light. If I remember correctly, it's about 700 or 800 grams. Now, there are also hangers like the Wakefield hanger that we replicated in the first batch from the Royal Armourers line, and that is also very light, about 800 grams if I remember correctly. So it's about the same weight as a infantry officer's sabre. I'll just grab an example. An infantry officer, oh, it's buried under swords now. An infantry officer's sword or sabre of the 19th century. So in fact, some of those small falchions weigh about the same as one of these infantry officers' swords. Again, it's because it's a sword for use on foot, predominantly, especially the short ones, for people like archers and billmen. So it's fulfilling the same purpose as the infantry officer's sword. Same purpose, similar weight range. Now, if we go to larger falchions, indeed you can get big two-handed ones and they're comparable weights to the long swords. For example, in Austria, in the Rüstkammer in Vienna, they've got examples of big two-handed Messer and they are exactly comparable in weight with longswords, with big longswords and great swords. But if we look at a typical falchion as used, let's say, in the 13th or 14th century, while they might look broad, they tend to be quite thin. Okay, and actually their weight ranges are not really higher than arming swords. They're very, very similar weight ranges. Things like the Conyers falchion, the Cluny falchion, these kinds of things, they weigh about the same as the weight range of arming swords. But just to reiterate, arming swords have quite a broad weight range, everything from sort of 750, 800 grams all the way up to 1300 grams, even sometimes even heavier than that, even up to 1500 grams, which is well within the weight range of long swords. Right, and finally, what are these light swords that people are talking about? As I say, as I come back to the small sword thing, so some small swords are very light at 400, 500 grams, about the same as a modern fencing épée, for example. However, even rapiers, a lot of people think of something like a rapier as being a light sword, are not. This and the original from the Wallace collection it's based on is around 1250, 1300 grams. So rapiers can be big and heavy, and in fact very often rapiers are heavier than medieval arming swords. So we often find medieval and even Viking era swords are lighter than rapiers. Just because something's broad or narrow, don't assume its weight. Okay, so that's the parting message. Don't assume weights from what a sword looks like. Just because a medieval arming sword might look bigger and broader, might look heavier than a rapier or a 19th century cavalry or officer's sword, doesn't mean it's heavier. Very often they are in exactly the same weight range, and this golden zone of one-handed swords seems to be 800 grams to 1300 grams. And ironically, some of the swords you might think are heavy, like a falchion, might be at the bottom of that range. Some of the swords that you might think are light, like a rapier, can be at the top end of that range. But equally, a given type of sword, like the Viking era sword here, can be at either end of that range. It could be 800 grams, it could be 1000 grams, it could be 1300 grams. Anyway, I suspect that this information is new to some of you, but it could also be useful to you if you're a video game designer, if you're a role-playing game designer, or if you're writing novels or something like that. So if you can think of someone that this information might be useful for, then please share this video around, because that's what I'm doing this video for. That's why I started my channel. That's why I fundamentally do my channel, is to try and spread information and truth. I never set out to be a YouTuber. I tried to spread facts about swords. So hopefully we can help together in 2024 to get some more facts about swords out there. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be, and I'll see you really soon back on the channel. Cheers, folks.